I don't know if that was the standard price, but there is an Albert Dürer exhibition on at the same time. So he went from the Stonehenge one to the Dürer one, and he said the Dürer one was brilliant. I think the Dürer one was about £20, but he said it was outstanding. So, you know, sometimes it'd be nice to be in London. Yeah. Okay. Oh, excuse me, bear with me.
Where are we? Oh, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, a couple of more minutes and say I'll introduce you, Cormac, and we'll then hopefully Cormac will mute, or not Cormac, Duncan will mute us all, and so.
It's a good collection of bones.
Where's this, Ken?
I said that's a good collection of bones I'm looking at.
Yes.
Just been very careful there.
Yes. I'm sure Cormac will tell us all about it.
I think the closed caption recording system is very amusing. I think it said there I was going to decortical all us about it. There's lots of. I think it's going to be lots of fun captions. It doesn't cope very well with our Ulster Archaeological Society accents.
Oh, well, I don't know. I have a lot of time for reading.
Oh yeah.
So
I use it to dictate text, and it's quite amusing what comes up.
So we have what 53 people already signed in for this, Cormac. So it's quite a good audience tonight.
About, yeah.
What's that? 53 now.
Yeah.
Very good. Bing. This is Olive Campbell.
Okay, one more minute, Cormac, and we'll kick off. Not a few more people. Yeah, it's 54. I
was just saying to Duncan, I'd probably turn my camera off because I'm using my phone as a camera because my other camera's been a bit dodgy.
Yeah.
And it seems to deplete the phone battery quite quickly. So I'll turn it off and then turn it on later during the questions.
Okay.
It is plugged in, but it doesn't seem to be drawing enough power from the little USB socket to do both.
Okay. Right. Okay, I think we'll kick off and say I'll do a brief introduction and then hand you over to Dr. Cormac MacSparran. So tonight's speaker for our February UAS evening lecture is Dr. Cormac MacSparran, and it's a good pleasure to be able to introduce Cormac. Cormac and I have worked together for more than 30 years, back in the halcyon days of digging in Carrickfergus in 1991. So I've worked with and known Cormac for a long, long time. So this is going to be a very enjoyable and very informative evening. Dr. Cormac MacSparran graduated with a BA in Archaeology and Modern History from Queen's University Belfast. He got an MPhil degree from Queen's as well, entitled The Medieval Coarse Pottery of Ulster, and a PhD from Queen's on statistical analysis of the single burial tradition in early Bronze Age Ireland and some implications for social structure. He worked for the Environment and Heritage Service on excavations and post-excavations from 1991 to 1995, which is where I met Cormac. And he was active in the private sector rescue archaeology from 1997 to 2001, before joining the Centre for Archaeological Fieldwork, Queen's University Belfast, as a fieldwork director in 2002. He has directed and published a number of important excavations of varying types and periods, and he's written a number of important research papers. And more recently, in 2021, last year, he published Burials in Society in late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age Ireland, which was the first publication in the Queen's University Belfast Irish Archaeological Monograph series, and which is published by Archaeopress. And UAS had the pleasure of launching this important book at our Discovery 2021 conference last November. So Cormac has a wide range of research interests, including the archaeology of migration and theoretical approaches to migration studies, funerary archaeology, the emergence of complex societies, the application of radiocarbon dating to archaeological problems, the Irish Neolithic and early Bronze Age, medieval potting traditions in Ireland, especially coarse potting, and why some periods of Irish prehistory and early history are aceramic. And tonight, Dr. McSparren is going to talk about funerary practice in Ireland in the early Bronze Age and what it tells us about the people who are buried and the society they came from. So I'll hand over to Dr. Cormac McSparren.
Thank you, Rory. I'm just actually going to turn off my, as I mentioned earlier, turn off my camera just to save battery and probably save all your eyes as well. And thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age burial and what we can say about how society changed during that period. And also, I want to really talk. I'm going to very briefly talk a little bit about how change occurred during those years, and also skip a little bit into the Middle Late Bronze Age, how some of the early Bronze Age sets the scene a little bit for developments which come later on. So I really want to rewind right back to, really before the Bronze Age proper, right into the Chalcolithic, the very start of the Chalcolithic, around about 2500 BC, was something very important that all all about already happens, and this is the emergence of copper working in Ireland, or the appearance of copper working in Ireland at Ross Island, roughly 2500 BC. And this is fantastically important for lots of reasons, not least because it's really the primary source of copper for Ireland and, well, most of Britain. So all of Ireland and most of Britain for the next 500 or 600 years all comes from Ross Island. And around this period of time, there are a number of other sort of very important changes that we see in the Irish archaeological record. The period leading up to about 2500 BC, the tail end of the Neolithic, seems to have been a little bit of a quiet period archaeologically. I mean, we do now have quite a lot of timber circles and stuff like that turning up in rescue excavations, but it does seem to have been a period of where there was maybe a gradual ebbing off in the level of activity. Some of that very stimulating work that our colleague Rowan McLaughlin published a couple of years or last year in Amania, looking at long-term trends in radiocarbon dating. And I know that work has been critiqued to some extent, and it probably does need some sort of degree of normalization to sort of take into account factors of, say, visibility of certain types of monuments or the actions of certain types of development, stuff like that. But nevertheless, it's a very important work and very stimulating work, and it seems to show a decreasing of radiocarbon activity in the late Neolithic. But then, as we get into the early Bronze Age, we see this sort of relative explosion of activity again, or the Chalcolithic and then early Bronze Age, a relative explosion of activity. One of the first things that we see, of course, are the beginnings of new burial practices. First, with the wedge tombs, which are again appearing at about the same time that the Ross Island mine appears. We've got clusters of wedge tombs down in Munster and clusters of wedge tombs up in West Ulster as well. And these are sort of appearing around about 2500 BC also, and staying there. There are periods of construction and primary use taking place over the next 200 or 300 years, and many of you have read the sort of Anting and Brindley paper on this, and also the work that Rick Schulting and Eileen Murphy have done on dating wedge tombs, and fairly well establishing at least their primary phase of use around this sort of Chalcolithic era. And then around about or just after 2200 BC, a new and very different burial tradition emerges in Ireland. The burial tradition, which has typically been called since Waddell's time onwards, the single burial tradition. And its identifying feature, if you like, that separates it from most of the earlier burial practices in Ireland before that, is the emphasis on the individual. It very much marks it separate from, the wedge tomb or megalithic traditions, where there has tended to be collective burial inside a very well-defined burial monument. In the single burial tradition, although there are still cemeteries, and in some cases there are burial monuments, multiple kist cairns, as they're sometimes called, or reuse of earlier Neolithic monuments. Nevertheless, the emphasis is very much on the individual within the grave. And we can see this when we look at the sort of statistics, if you like, of the number of individuals placed into these single burial tradition graves. I have a database that I collected as part of a PhD of these burials. Now, it's by no means exhaustive, partly because some burials were maybe antiquarian excavations, in which maybe there wasn't the required quality of evidence to make them worthwhile integrating into the database. In some cases, work was ongoing and hadn't been completed, so maybe wasn't included in the database. But I have about 600 individuals over several hundred different burials, individual graves in my database. And of those, you can probably see from the graphs here, the majority, at least half of the individuals, and more than half of the graves, of course, are the burials of individuals, with occasional, quite a lot of burials with 2 or 3 individuals in it, but very few with larger numbers than that. So almost all the burials are either the burials of individuals or the burials of small groups of people. There are a few burials, of course, which are apparently empty of human remains. In most of these cases, it's probably just because of the sort of post-depositional taphonomic sort of processes that occur, a combination of erosion and rotting and animal disturbance and human disturbance and other things. But in a few cases, of course, there may be burials which never contained human remains, which either were built and then never used, or alternatively, maybe in the case of a missing body, someone lost at sea, perhaps, the burial ritual was carried out with not necessarily the individual to place in the burial. There is within the single burial tradition, as many of you will be aware from your reading, quite a wide variety of different types of burial practice. So there is both cremation and inhumation. The number of cremations outweighs the number of inhumations by quite a bit. Just over 60% of single burial tradition burials, individual burials, are cremations. There are a few occasions, of course, where both cremation and inhumation are present in one grave, and just about 25% of burials are inhumations. In terms of the types of graves themselves, there are a number of different varieties. There are both kist burials, which of course are the famous stone boxes, if you like, ubiquitous, it seems, in the early Bronze Age period. These take a number of forms. There are rectangular kists. There are some rectangular kists, probably just badly made kists. And then, of course, there are the polygonal kists, many of which are constructed around an urn burial. And they seem to a certain extent anyway reflect the form of the urn placed into the ground, although, of course, there are polygonal kists without urns. And then there are pit burials also, simple holes dug into the ground, sometimes large holes which can accommodate an inhumation, sometimes just very small pits dug just to accept an urn, or maybe even a small cremation without any accompanying vessel. And there are also within cairns periodically found just little patches of bone, cremated bone, typically pressed into a little gap between the stones. A grike, as it's sometimes called in the literature, doesn't really count as a pit as such, just a little space between the stones utilised for the deposition of human remains. And of course, there is a plethora of different ceramic styles associated with early Bronze Age burial. There are several different styles of what are described as bowls. That's the sort of squatter, wider vessels. Excuse me. There are the vessels which are described as vases, which are slightly taller and necked. And then, of course, there are the various different urn traditions, the vase urns and the encrusted urns, and then the collared urns and the cordoned urns. Together, the amount of different variety in the early Bronze Age single burial tradition seems quite perplexing. In addition to the different types of grave, the different types of treatment of the body, and the different types of funerary vessels that often accompany these burials, there is at different times and places, a significant assemblage of grave goods found with these burials. It does vary through time, and that's something I'll talk about as we go on. But there are, there are copper objects, daggers, copper pins, bone pins, flint tools, razors, and little, pygmy cups and vessels that are associated with the burial that aren't the normal types of funerary vessels that we typically find. There's jewellery, bone objects, quite a number of different types of bone objects, including some which may well be whistles, something we're talking about really in a different day. But there is quite a variety, especially in the later period of the early Bronze Age, of grave goods appearing throughout the tradition. With regards to this sort of plethora of different types of burial practice, multiple different types of burial practice, until recent decades, it was quite difficult to tease this out. There were some general trends had been noticed by people like John Waddell and Charles Mount, who did great work, and Lawrence Flanagan as well, great work teasing out as much as they could about this tradition without the benefits of the things like Bayesian radiocarbon statistical analysis and the large number of radiocarbon dates which have become available in recent years, partly because of research such as Anna Brindley's work on ceramic, dating early Bronze Age ceramics, which generally meant dating early Bronze Age burials. And also the material that's available from other research projects and from rescue archaeology and other things. But the number of radiocarbon dates that we have now, and the ability to in parallel with that, map aspects of the single burial tradition across Ireland has allowed the teasing out of some of these strands of burial practice and the development of what I think is a reasonably coherent scheme for the single burial tradition. And I'm going to just talk initially in sort of general terms about chronology a little bit. There are about 150 radiocarbon dates that I used in my database for the single burial tradition. Anna Brindley has some more, but I didn't integrate them into my database, or all of her dates, because some of them were from the types of antiquarian excavations which I was not focusing on. So I have about 150 early Bronze Age radiocarbon dates in my database. And of those, I have trimmed down a certain number because of issues to do with provenance in some cases, issues to do with the old wood effect, of course, that sort of perennial problem with radiocarbon dating where you may have a big lump of charcoal of unknown wood, and it might be a big lump of oak, could be 200 or 300 years potentially older than what you're actually dating. So I've winnowed the database a little bit down to about 120 sort of useful dates. And when you date the entirety of the single burial tradition using some of Oxcal, the Bayesian analysis techniques of Oxcal, to sort of bracket, if you like, the start and age ranges of the early Bronze Age single burial tradition, you get very much the indication of a tradition which is starting, well, probably around 2150 BC. I think you can see the graphic in front of you. There's two different sorts of sets of age ranges there, a sort of a 95% probability age range and a 68% probability age range. So we're roughly talking about a tradition which is emerging in the around about the middle of the 22nd century BC and it's lasting until around about 1600 BC. I've also a second graphic there, if you like, which is an analysis of the dates of the appearance of the single burial tradition in different provinces, and you'll immediately note it's slightly contradictory from what is the age ranges suggested for the Irish single burial tradition as a whole. There are technical reasons for this. Whenever you use a tool like Oxcal, or any sort of statistical tool really, to try and estimate a range, the more data you have, the tighter the range you'll be able to estimate. And I think that's sort of a general purpose of sort of laboratory errors of any type. And it's also true for this sort of analysis of multiple radiocarbon dates. And whenever you divide your sort of your database, if you like, into four chunks, Ulster, Munster, Leinster, and Connacht, to try and sort of date them, you very often end up with slightly wider age ranges than the age range for the entirety of the island. And however, it's still a useful exercise because if you look down the sets of dates, although you will see they're slightly older in some cases than the actual likely date of the tradition, you will notice that Munster seems to be a little bit younger than the three other provinces, sorry, not younger, a little bit later than the three other provinces. And it does seem, in fact, that the single burial tradition in Munster doesn't get going properly until a little bit after the single burial tradition seems to be established in the other three provinces. And I think you can see there the idea that it takes maybe somewhere between 70 and 100 years longer for the single burial tradition to appear in Munster. It seems to be a reasonable inference from the radiocarbon estimations of the tradition as a whole. And some of the distributions of artifacts and other burial practices across Ireland probably indicate this as well. Now, I'm a little bit cynical. I'm not cynical, it's not the right word, but a little bit critical, as are others, of not of all of Anna Brindley's work on dating ceramics. Some of it's excellent, but some of her more nuanced pieces, are maybe a little too selective of the data that she uses to achieve her results, and are possibly putting the model a little bit before the data. So I wouldn't want to place too much emphasis on her very nuanced dating of individual variants of the bowl and vase tradition, but nevertheless, taking her and other people's work into account, it does seem that the simple bowls are probably slightly earlier than the more developed versions of bowls and vases as they go through the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. And you can see, if you look at distribution maps of simple bowls, bipartite bowls, and the ribbed bowls and tripartite vessels, that there, as the bowl form develops, distribution becomes more developed through Ireland, and really it's only in the ribbed bowl, the latest of the bowl variants, you start to get ribbed bowls with single burial traditions in Southwest Ireland, in the sort of Munster area. Similarly, with kists and pits, we know that kists probably predate pits a little bit, but both kists and pits seem to be making their way down into Munster a little bit later than they are in other parts of the country. So I just want to, just going to read back a little bit. So I think we have a slide there sequence, but kists and pit and polygonal kist dating also shows a sequence of activity. Kists are almost certainly the earliest type of grave in the single burial tradition. Again, their general dating is of their emergence is fairly similar to the general dating of the single burial tradition as a whole, but of course slightly wider date ranges and apparently slightly earlier date ranges because of the smaller number of graves in the radiocarbon analysis. But again, this analysis does show that kists are probably slightly earlier than pits, maybe a gap of a few decades, maybe 50 years between them, and then another little gap of maybe 50 or 60 years between pits and the appearance of polygonal kists. And of course, the appearance of polygonal kists, as already suggested, may well be related to the emergence of the first burials in which cremated remains are placed into vessels rather than vessels accompanying human remains. The emergence of the first urns, effectively. With regards to cremation and inhumation, similarly, inhumation seems to be a practice which is appearing somewhere between 70 and 90 years, maybe at most 100 years before cremation. So cremation does seem to be a little bit later than the emergence of cremation. And as I say again, remember all of these values, because they're looking at slightly the smaller number of dates than for the whole of the tradition, always have slightly wider estimations than the estimation for the date of a phenomenon like the whole of the tradition, which has a larger number of available dates to make the error estimation, essentially. These two plots are radiocarbon plots of all the inhumation dates and cremation dates, and you'll see that sorry, going the wrong way. You'll see that the inhumation dates could have, from the red best fit line through them, a sort of very continuous sort of regular rate of deposition of kist burials until about 1900 BC, when they become, inhumation burials until about 1900 BC, when they become a little less common, and they may actually stop for a period of time around
Cormac, the sound seems to have gone. Hi, Cormac. I hope you can hear me. This is Rory here. The sound appears to have gone from your presentation.
Can anyone hear?
I'm trying to contact Cormac to see what the problem is. So if you bear with us, it seems to be a technical glitch at the minute. I'm trying to contact him.
Okay.
Okay, bear with us, please.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, right. Right, bye-bye. Hello? Hold on.
We can
That's
hear
Cormac.
you. Yeah, we can hear you, Cormac. Far away.
Great.
Hello? Can people hear me?
Yes, Cormac.
Yes.
Yep.
Hello?
Cormac, we can hear you.
Hello?
We can hear you. Yeah.
I can hear you.
Hi, we could hear Cormac.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear him. So if he wants to fire
Can
away.
you hear me?
Yes, they can hear you now. Cormac.
Right, that's okay. I can't hear them for some reason. I don't know why. Right. Right. Sorry about that. I'm not really sure what happened there. But right, I can't hear you, but I think you can hear me. So I'm going to continue, and I'll go right back to where I was a few minutes ago. So it's probably quite good because the slides got slightly out of sequence at one stage, and I got a little bit confused about where I was. So maybe it's better that we've gone back a little bit. But apologies, I'm not quite sure what happened there. Something to do with my phone and its battery dying. So right. So I was mentioning right. Sorry, the dating of kists, polygonal kists, and pits. Basically, radiocarbon analysis would suggest that kists are a little bit earlier than pits, and that pits are a little bit earlier than polygonal kists. There seems to be about 50 years probably separating kists from pits, and that polygonal kists probably don't start until about 100 120 years after the commencement of the single burial tradition. Again, I emphasize, as I have before, that the date ranges for the kists, polygonal kists, and pits are slightly lengthened by the fact that there are, relative to the entirety of the single burial tradition, fewer of these being radiocarbon dated and being analysed. Similarly, cremation seems to be a practice which is a little bit later than inhumation. Inhumation is very much the dominant practice at the start of the single burial tradition, whereas cremation seems to emerge somewhere around 70 or 90 years after the commencement of the single burial tradition. Of course, as you can see from these couple of plots here, inhumations continue really through the whole of the single burial tradition, but sometime around about 1900 BC, if you follow the slope of these red lines, and I'm actually redoing these at present using a new technique, which is a little more scientific than a red line, but using tempo plots and kernel density estimations. I'll be redoing this and hopefully presenting this at a later stage and writing it up as a separate paper. But you can see that from the slope of these red lines that inhumation continues through the early Bronze Age period, but drops off in intensity a little bit after about 1900 BC. And something similar is happening with kist burials. Kist burials sort of starting around 2150, 2170, 2180 BC, and continuing with a quite intense sort of level of activity, and then dropping off a little bit, becoming a little bit less common around about 1900 BC. One of the things about the single burial tradition is that practices tend to accumulate without necessarily earlier practices being cast off. So you get, say, the addition of cremation as a treatment of the dead, but that does not necessarily mean that inhumation ceases being used immediately. In fact, inhumation continues at a reduced level of intensity the whole way through the early Bronze Age, right up until the very end of the early Bronze Age. This was the slide which I was going to show earlier and got out of sequence and slightly maybe trip up for a minute or two before I was rescued by my microphone. But this slide just emphasizes again the fact that inhumation, which we know is an early practice, which becomes less common as time goes on, is hardly found at all in Southwest Ireland and Munster in the dated sites in my database. But cremation, which is a practice which emerges after a little bit of time in the single burial tradition and then continues the whole way through the early Bronze Age, is much more commonly represented in Munster. And similarly with bipartite and tripartite vases, you've got a couple of them down there. They're distributed across the whole of the country. And this emphasizes that what's happening in Munster is a slightly delayed uptake of the single burial tradition. In round terms, probably about a century later than the rest of the country. I want to talk a little bit about the potless-burial phenomenon. Now, the potless-burial phenomenon was first noticed really by Waddell, or first at least drawn attention to by Waddell. And Waddell hadn't the benefit of large numbers of radiocarbon dates and the ability to analyze radiocarbon dates like we have now, but Waddell was able to suggested that these burials were probably associated with the bowl tradition. These were burials where there was an inhumation or a cremation in a kist or in a pit, but where they were unaccompanied by a ceramic vessel. The bulk of burials of the single burial tradition are accompanied by a ceramic vessel, or alternatively, if they've been cremated, are frequently placed into a ceramic vessel like an urn. And these were marked out as separate from the rest of the tradition because they did not have either a vessel accompanying them or not placed into a vessel. And Waddell assumed that these were early, and he assumed that these were part of the bowl tradition.
We now, however, do have quite a large number of radiocarbon dates, which allow themselves to be analysed. To see quite a large number, a moderate number really, but enough to get an idea of the spread of this tradition. And well, we very much get the idea that this tradition continues right to the very end of the Bronze Age, or sorry, the early Bronze Age. Continue probably maybe as late as 1600s, even 1500 and something BC, something like that. But also there's an indication that they don't actually start right at the very, very start of the single burial tradition. In fact, the radiocarbon analysis would probably suggest that the first phase, if you like, of the single burial tradition, there's a universal accompaniment of burials by funerary vessels. So these potless burials, they really the realization that they're not just a small phase of poor burials, or sort of simple burials at the very start of the single burial tradition, but rather they're a development a little bit into the single burial tradition, which then continues the whole way through the rest of the early Bronze Age. It does two things. It emphasizes the fact that all, it appears, of the first phase of the early Bronze Age's burials are accompanied by vessels, and it also shows us that even very late in the early Bronze Age, when we have all these relatively opulent sort of urn burials and cordoned urn burials and stuff like that, with bronze daggers and pins and stuff like that in them, and jewelry, that we still have a very simple and plain parsimonious tradition sort of running in parallel to it. And it emphasizes this accumulative nature of the early Bronze Age burial, that it seems to more and more traditions seem to be added to it. I think I'm getting Rory's texts coming through telling me that my audio wasn't working, or coming through now. The potless burial is quite significant and has implications for the early Bronze Age society, which were not immediately apparent. So taking these things together, and I've sort of got a sort of quite difficult to interpret radiocarbon sort of summary on the left-hand side there of various different aspects of the tradition, the various different pottery types and the various different grave types and practices like cremation and inhumation and potless burials. I say it's difficult to interpret because what I've tried to do is to summarize the radiocarbon ranges, the introductory ranges, if you like, in light and middle grey, and the end ranges in light and middle grey at either end of the bars, with the black bit in the center, the absolute 100% certain sort of distribution at either end of the likely and probable, or likely and possible ranges. So the black bars are much too short to actually be genuinely representative, but and each of these is in its own way affected by the number of dates in which the interpretation is based on. So it's a very difficult charter graph to interpret, but it gives it a basic idea of the sort of spread of these different types of practices. And using this and the other sort of information, it's possible to summarize, if you like, the single burial tradition into three basic big chronological chunks. Now, especially with phase C, it might be possible in the future to tease a little bit more out, especially integrating more radiocarbon dating, maybe from other sources. But essentially, it seems that the first phase of the single burial tradition, which in broad terms, 2200 to maybe 2050 BC, is dominated by kists initially, with the addition probably of pit burials, maybe after 50 or 60 years into the tradition. All of these vessels seem to be associated with all of these burials seem to be associated with funerary vessels, and also all of these burials seem to be inhumations. There is little distinction in any of these burials when you look at them statistically in any way between the burials of men and women. The vessels that are being used for men and women are the same. The sizes of kists are the same. The placement in cemeteries seems to be the same for men and women. In these phase A burials, children are present, but they only seem to be buried with adults. In phase B, which is really the century from 2050 to 1950 BC in general terms, cremation is now becoming dominant. In fact, it probably becomes dominant quite quickly. And cremation occurs both in kists and in pits. Pottery is no longer universal. We have the beginning of the potless burial phenomenon at this period of time, around about 2050. Women are more likely not to have a pot, or less likely to have an accompanying pottery vessel than men. And this is the first, if you like, sign of differentiation based on sex in the single burial tradition, or for significant. There are actually, if it was really, deep, if I had 3 or 4 hours to talk about this, there are some very slight distinctions in the prevalence of decoration on phase A, funerary vessels, between men and women, but that's the only real distinction in phase A. But in phase B, women definitely seem to be less likely to have an accompanying pot. Grave goods are still optional, but they're slightly more common than they are in phase A. Phase A grave goods are really quite uncommon. Only 1 in every 20 or so graves has any sort of grave good really at all. In phase B, we start to see grave goods occurring more occasionally, but it's still 1 in every 7 or 8 graves that will have a grave good, and frequently the grave goods are relatively simple, a flint scraper or something like that. These are not in the main opulent burials. In phase B, in this period, we see the first hints of the beginning of urn-type burials, cremations in vessels. Initially, it seems to be cremations placed into a vase. There are also some hints from the radiocarbon analysis that that maybe the encrusted urns might just be making their way into phase B a little bit, and certainly the vase urns do seem to be as well. So we're somewhere during this century, we're starting to see the first hints of the urn traditions, which then dominate the later phase C, which is really from 1950 through to about 1600 BC. These are now in the main cremations, and most of these cremations are placed within urns. Typically, they're placed in pits or small kists. There are still occasional larger rectangular kists with cremations, and even very occasionally inhumations in them dating to this period as well. But most burials are now cremations with urns and pits and small kists. Grave goods are becoming more popular, or more common. I don't know if popular is the right word. And that's especially true for cordoned urns, but it's true for all of the urn types. All urn burials are more likely to contain grave goods than the previous burials. Men and women and children are represented in all of these burials, except really for the most opulent burials, which seem to be the burials exclusively or at least overwhelmingly of adult men. And that's something which I'll return to in a few minutes and talk about in more detail. And yes, bowls and vases are somewhat in decline during this period, but bowls and vases probably don't really continue to the very end. Well, they may continue to the very end of the period, but they're certainly less common as we start getting beyond about 1750 BC. They're very much a pottery form on the decline through the tail end of this period. So just to show a few examples of these classic sort of phase A burial, what everybody thinks of when they think of an early Bronze Age kist burial: nice rectangular kist, crouched inhumation, accompanying funerary vessel. Grave goods rare, but not unknown. And just again to emphasize that new burial practices are continually being added from phase A onwards, but the older traditions are never entirely abandoned whenever new traditions come along. Around phase B, cremation appears for the first time in the burial record, and this is an extremely important change. Also, the second important change is the fact that an accompanying pottery vessel is now an option. In other words, a pottery vessel is not de rigueur placed in the grave with the individual. And again, it's only really because of radiocarbon dating and Bayesian analysis that we've really been able to tease out those two, these two strands, if you like, of burial practice. Otherwise, it would seem completely and utterly intertwined with each other. Cremation is a fantastically important change. There is, of course, cremation in Neolithic Irish burials, but certainly for the opening period of the single burial tradition, there is no cremation whatsoever. And the interesting thing is how, although as I keep emphasizing, inhumation never disappears, quite how rapidly cremation becomes the dominant funerary form. It starts, sometime around 2050 BC, and within a few decades, it seems to be almost the normative funerary ritual. And certainly by 1950 BC, we can see that inhumation is very much the lesser funerary treatment of the dead, and it continues that way through the rest of the early Bronze Age period. And of course, cremation isn't easy. It takes a lot of wood to cremate someone, especially to cremate someone well. And one thing you can say about osteoarchaeologists who examine cremated remains from the early Bronze Age, generally speaking, they're very well cremated. These are not cremations where the body is partially burned or combusted. Level of combustion is high. The temperature has been high. There's been plenty of oxygen, plenty of wood. They're well they're well cremated. So that takes an awful lot of effort, and you have to think about why people want to do that. And I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, and I think it comes down, at least to some extent, to ancient concepts and sometimes even more modern concepts of death and how death occurs. And of course, in most pre-modern societies, death is not an instantaneous thing. We have a concept now of death happening at an instant. We define it by the heart stopping beating, or we define it by the end of brain activity or something similar. But in early societies, it doesn't really happen that way. Death is you can't be sure sometimes if someone's dead. You have to wake them. You have to leave them for a period of time before you can be sure that they've stopped moving, but stopped being the quick of the dead. And in many societies, the concept that death extends over a really quite extended period of time is prevalent. There are many societies in which death is not thought to fully happen until the body has been liberated from the bones, if you like, until decomposition has taken place. And I think it's with these sort of ideas and the fears that go along with them that cremation may play a role. If you look at the classic sort of Hertzian analyses of death in sort of Southeast Asian societies, then there's often a fear of not treating the human remains properly, not honouring the ancestors properly in the period between death and decomposition, and all sorts of bad luck can befall you if you don't carry out the appropriate rituals and rites and treat the body in the appropriate way. You can shortcut all that if you carry out a cremation. And this ties in maybe with something that has been noticed by many writers. Waddell, Charles Mount have noticed, and my statistics have demonstrated as well, that early Bronze Age burials, kists especially, are almost always located in very, very dry, typically gravelly or even sandy soil. And maybe there's something about fear of decomposition not happening. The idea that what could be worse than opening a kist and finding in the bottom of the kist, rather than dry, decomposed bones, that waterlogging had left your ancestor to sort of to be preserved, semi-preserved anyway, in an awful state in the bottom of the grave, rather than having made the proper journey to the other world through decomposition. And cremation bypasses all that. And the fact that cremation is difficult and uses a lot of resources is sanctioned by the fact that it avoids the risk of the fear, if you like, that the soul, the restless soul or spirit of the dead person who has not yet been properly liberated from their earthly remains is somehow lingering around and angry at the appropriate rites and rituals not have been fully observed. And cremation cuts through all that and allows a swift passage of the deceased to the afterlife. And this is one reason for explaining why this otherwise very, you could almost argue, wasteful ritual so quickly comes to dominate early Bronze Age funerary ritual in Ireland. There's a great quote from a couple of Scandinavian archaeologists, Sorensen and Rebay, and it is: the understanding of what constitutes a grave lags behind what constitutes a body. And you notice that sometimes some of the early sort of cremations are in huge big kists, big enough to put a boxer in or something like that, and in one little corner of it, there's a tiny cremation sort of sitting all lonely, and then within a relatively short period of time, you start to notice, and it can be demonstrated. I've demonstrated statistically that within a short period of time, kists for cremation and pits for cremation become smaller, and then of course the urn starts to be used to hold the remains, and this is a significant new development in burial ritual. There are again, radiocarbon dating of the various different urns suggests probably that vase urns are the first, with encrusted urns appearing at about the same time or very slightly afterwards. Very slightly, as maybe a decade or two at most afterwards. And it does seem from both the form and from the associations of vases, vase urns, and encrusted urns that they really form part of the same tradition, the same very much ceramic funerary tradition. I mean, vases are often found with encrusted urns as accompanying vessels, along with encrusted urn burials. The types of grave goods where you got them with vase burials tend to be very similar to the types of grave goods that are found with encrusted urn burials. It does seem that they're part of the same tradition, and of course, they all overlap chronologically. Interestingly, sorry, I'm slightly out of sync. I'm going to go forward and then back. Collared urn and corded urns likewise seem to overlap chronologically quite a lot with the encrusted and the vase urns. The collared urns more than the corded urns. Radiocarbon analysis would suggest that almost certainly collared urns are in use at the same time as encrusted urns and vase urns. Corded urns may be in use at the same time, but it's not so certain. I would say probably with small p, they're all in use at the same time, but it is just possible that the corded urns emerge a little bit after the period of time when collared and encrusted and vase urns are passing out of use. But the most likely is that at least for a period, they're all in contemporary use together. Just to talk a little bit about origins of urn burial. Sorry, coughing a little bit. It does seem that, again, to take that Sorensen and Rebay sort of comment, as cremation becomes more embedded, funerary ritual, separate from cremation, starts to modify itself around the new practices. Initially, with vases being overturned over cremated remains, and then larger urns big enough to actually properly hold the cremated remains, and then pits and kists starting to change their form to suit the new funerary treatment of the body, namely cremation. Also, in this phase C of urn burial, grave goods, as I mentioned a couple of times, become quite a lot more common, especially with corded urns, but actually with all the urn types, that they become more common, and you start to see fairly frequently copper objects such as daggers and pins, and other finely made objects, like very nicely made bone pins, for instance, as well as copper pins and amber beads and other types of jewellery. Fairly frequently to faience beads turning up in grave C or phase C graves. Location is very important for all the phases of the single burial tradition. Again, statistical analysis can tell us quite a lot. Statistical analysis demonstrates that across pretty much every cemetery where we have a defined edge, because of course some flat cemeteries we don't have a defined edge, so it's hard, or we don't now have a defined edge. We may, of course, in the past, but it's no longer detectable. But where we have a defined edge, we can say where the edge of the cemetery is, such as in a cairn, a Bronze Age burial cairn, or a reused cairn into which Bronze Age burials are placed, early Bronze Age burials are placed. We can see that burials are much more common on the east side of the monuments. In fact, they may be more common even on the southeast side. And there does seem to be a tentative, but probably reliable radiocarbon inferences that the southeast side fills up first and then the northeast side. There also is teetering just below the level of statistical significance, an overrepresentation of females in the centre half, if you like, of mounds, and an overrepresentation of men in the outer half of the mounds. I actually think that by tinkering a little bit with this, it might be possible to get that up to the level of statistical significance, because only recently it occurred to me, of course, that the area in a circle is dependent on the square of the radius, not on the half the radius. So I'm going to redo those stats and see if I can get it up to statistical significance by taking into account the fact that my simple division of the circle in half was not a division of the radius in half. It's also worth noting that two interesting phenomena around multiple burials in burial mounds. Generally speaking, multiple burial is thought by sort of burial theorists, if you like, to probably denote slightly lower status. You know, if you're really important, you'll have a burial all of your own, not necessarily will anyone put in there with you. Burial mounds and meaning by that cairns, or the reuse of previous purpose-built cairns, or the reuse of previous Neolithic monuments. Burial mounds have significantly less multiple burials than ordinary flat cemeteries, and that's consistent really with, I suppose, either sort of taking and reappropriating an earlier important site, sort of relics of old decency, if you like, taking a pre-existing Neolithic mound and using it, or alternatively getting a purpose-built multiple kist cairn, early Bronze Age burial cairn constructed. That sort of extra effort is more likely to denote high status. Phase C burials, urn burials as a whole, are less likely to be found in mounds. But it's very interesting that the most opulent of the phase C burials, the burials of cordon urns in particular, are most likely to be found in burial mounds, pre-existing burial mounds, often, like of course the mound of the hostages at Tara, which is quite a collection of phase C burials inserted into that pre-existing Neolithic passage tomb. So I have here a slide of a quick recap of the three phases just before moving on. I don't really think I want to spend too long on that, especially since we've lost a few minutes already. But just to emphasize that there are three reasonably clearly defined phases, chronological phases, and that there are new burial practices being added on, such as cremation, such as pottery becoming optional, such as interment in urns, but that with each new body of practice being brought along, the old practices are not necessarily being discarded, and through this era, funerary complexity keeps increasing. And I want to bring this now. That's the sort of the funeral practices, if you like, summarized of the Chalcolithic and late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, and they are pretty complex set of behaviors going on there. And I want to now tie this back to society, and I'm going to very, very quickly talk about how archaeologists think about society. Some of you will know these names. Many of you will. Service, Freed, Salons. The very much sort of the anthropologists who thought about how society was structured, very influential on American processual archaeology, and to an extent Irish, British, and European archaeology as well. Excuse me. These guys typically looked at schemes for splitting up different types of societies according to their social complexity or their ranking. And they explicitly tied in a kind of Marxian way social complexity to the economic base, which is quite a reasonable thing to do, really. If you have a complex society, one presumes you must have a complex economic base to base that upon. There are two different ways of looking at this. One way is looking purely at a continuum, if you like, of ranking, from non-ranked, or what we would call maybe popularly egalitarian societies, through to ranked societies, which are societies where there's emergent hierarchy. There are two different types of those, of course. There's achieved ranked societies, which is essentially what they call career open to talent, if you like, where your personal attributes and personal achievements build rank. And then there are ranked societies in which ranking is ascribed to you by accident of birth, if you like, by your lineage. And then, of course, there are very ranked societies which are described as stratified. And the distinction between, if you like, these non-ranked and achieved ranked societies and then ascribed and stratified ranked societies really comes down to the access to the means of production. So, in non-ranked societies, or in societies where, your achievement is based on your own personal qualities and the things you take on and achieve and do, then generally you'll find that the land is free, if you like. You don't have to hold the land off anyone else. Raw materials, likewise, are free for you to go and work them. There is not necessarily any overarching body or any overarching elite group divvying up who gets what, if you like, of the access to the means of production and subsistence. The earth hasn't been monetized in the way that it is later on. As you move into the ascribed and stratified societies, well, with the ascribed societies, where there's there's ranking based on lineage, and there's maybe something like a prestige goods economy, where the aristocracy control one aspect of the economy, say like metal production, for instance, but they do not necessarily have later concepts of, say, royal authority owning the whole of the landscape and people holding land off the monarch rather than owning land themselves in their family groups or collectively. And then the stratified societies are those in which everything essentially is controlled by an elite group. The idea that the king owns everything and people hold things off the king, sort of the medieval feudal, if you like, model. And some of these archaeologists have stuck labels on some of these as well, such as they banned small groups up to a couple hundred people, tribes, sort of larger, much more complex societies with several thousand people, and offices within them which different people fulfill, but generally in which the offices are not down to lineage or down to accident of birth. And then different things like big man societies, where you're starting to get a little bit of emerging hierarchy based on the ability of an individual or a warlord, if you like, and then moving into what we then think of sort of chiefdoms in the sort of more sort of later prehistoric way of sort of emergent royal families, if you like, heading towards simple states. So that's sort of the way that archaeologists have co-opted some of the anthropological sort of nomenclature, if you like, to think about society and think about how society structure, social structure. And then to marry that with then some of the ideas about how archaeologists think about death. And many of course will be aware of Lewis Binford Lewis Binford was one of the first people in the 1960s to explicitly say that, there's a link between social complexity and funerary complexity. And he suggested that, there was going to be a continuum and an arrow of progress, if you like, as the society become more complex. So would the burial rituals. And he also suggested that the highest status groups should have the highest status, in inverted commas, burials. A number of other writers come after Lewis Binford, because although Lewis Binford's ideas were revolutionary, they actually proved quite difficult to operationalize. So people like Tainter came along, and he added to this by, suggesting that, because Lewis Binford had given us the clues, but hadn't really given us really very good ideas about how to evaluate burials. Or the ideas that he did give us didn't seem to work very well. But Tainter said, well, maybe we should look at evaluating burials by trying to think about the amount of effort that's been put into the burial. And that will give us some ideas into how to evaluate how much status there is as to how much effort. So, if you've moved a block of 100 tons, it probably implies someone has maybe more status or more importance in society than if you move a block that is 100 weight, rather than 100 tons. So that sort of idea. And then, two archaeologists, Peebles and Cuss, really explicitly set out a set of criteria, correlates as they called them, that they thought should be met by any sort of thing that was a functioning chiefdom with a proper functioning sort of hierarchical, aristocratic, royal group within it. And they suggested that there should be really three classes of burials: a lower class of burials, or organized, mainly according to certain physical attributes, if you like. A higher class of burials where physical attributes like age and sex would be evenly represented. In other words, if you're poor, your society will be split up probably along lines of age and or sex. If you're reasonably wealthy, part of the aristocratic group, if you like, all ages and sexes will get a fair crack at the whip when it comes to burial, but only the elite group at the very top will have the symbols of wealth and power, and they'll mainly be adult males. So practical ways of trying to take this and look at burial complexity. One of the things we have, and we can see without having to analyze it very deeply, is that there is increasing funerary complexity through the Irish Early Bronze Age. That's sort of fairly evident without any sort of stats. But it's possible by sort of doing some relatively simple sort of analysis of the sort of Tainter idea to sort of to look at well, for a few things. For start, if you simply even just forget about Tainter and just think about the binary choices that there are available to the early Bronze Age sort of undertaker in each of the three phases, you can see that with each level of extra complexity, each level of extra funerary practice that you add significant extra potential dimensions of choice to the degree of process. So if you go from three basic choices in phase A, which is individual or multiple, kist or pit, burial location in a flat cemetery or cemetery mound, that's 9 possible ways of burying. If you add into phase B the fact that for instance now the use or not of a pottery vessel in the burial, or the ritual of cremation or inhumation, both choices you have available in phase B, that's a possible 32 combinations of actual attributes. That's the potential to express a lot more social complexity. And the same is true then in phase C, because not only do you have potentially more binary choices, but you also then have, well, it's not a binary choice, the choice of many different types of grave goods of different, very, very clearly different status, everything from a flint scraper to a copper dagger or a battle axe, or a beautiful necklace. There are lots of different choices to represent the individual in funerary practice, giving you, well, 64 choices, depending on what way you enumerate and codify the grave good assemblages, but clearly more than in previous periods. I did try and use again Tainter's energy expenditure concept to look at grave goods. It's quite crude, but the idea that a grave good that's unimproved object, unretouched flake, is a different level from a well-defined, skillfully made object of a commonplace raw material, which is different again from an object of copper or gold or complex jewelry. Hello? I think, did we lose people? No. Still here. Lost for a second there, just for a second. I think I'm still streaming.
We can hear you.
If I'm not, Rory, give me a text.
Can you hear us, Cormac?
So
Can't see your images.
cluster analysis is another way of looking at this. Cluster analysis is a technique for reducing complexity, and I attempted to use Tainter's energy expenditure concept to use cluster analysis to arrive at different groups and look at the number of different groups within a number of different clusters of behavior, if you like, within each of the three. Hello? Right, okay. I thought that might happen. I'm not sure what's happening here. I'll try and get it back. Thank you. Right. Right. I think you might be able to see this. I hope. Thank you, Declan. That was wonderful. Sorry about these technical difficulties. I'm not really sure what's going wrong. Excuse me. Cluster analysis is a technique for reducing complexity amongst big, diverse data sets. And it essentially clumps groups of like cases together. And hopefully there's a mashup between the clusters that we see and real world validity. And there are a number of statistical tools for looking at how discrete the clusters are and how well they match the sort of various different data. And I took the energy expenditure concept of Tainter and tried to operationalize it for looking at these particular types of burials. And I did that by giving scores of 1 or 0 to each of the choices that was available, based on the one with the higher energy expenditure having the 1, and the one with the lower energy expenditure having the 0, and then clustered these together for each of the 3 phases of the burial tradition. Also, each individual cluster member was given an index value, meaning that you could cross-tabulate it with any burial attributes which were not used in the clustering process. Quite important, of course, if you try to keep those separate, because if you cross-tabulate it with the burial attributes that were in the clustering process, of course, it would be meaningless. But to do it with other attributes that were outside the clustering process allows some further statistical testing to be carried out. Phase A, 4 clusters, essentially showed exactly what you would expect of a tribal-based society with very little ranking. So if we're going back to the concepts earlier, a non-ranked society, or possibly just a society in which there was maybe a little bit of emerging ranking, maybe based on personal ability, but nothing more sophisticated than that. Phase B, cluster results. There wasn't any clear evidence for sexual differentiation, despite the fact that we noted earlier the fact that pottery is sometimes less commonly present in phase B clusters. But what was really interesting is that the highest status cluster had a significant overrepresentation, statistically significant overrepresentation of older persons, and also that the second highest cluster had an overrepresentation of adolescents. And this seems to similarly indicate a relatively unranked society. The emotional, possibly emotional engaging of the mourning, if you like, lost potential, as it's sometimes said in the anthropological literature, of adolescence, and representing that with the second highest status cluster, if you like, or energy cluster in the phase B results, is something which you wouldn't expect in a hierarchical or a ranked society. It's very much the sort of a behavior that you expect in an unranked society. Generally speaking, people in unranked societies are more free to carry out emotional-based representation in funerary practice than they are in ranked societies. And the other thing we can say about this is that although it may have a little bit more complexity, and it does seem to have more complexity than the phase A results and phase A clusters, it does not appear to be a society which is a big man society. Big man societies tend not to have high status representations for older persons because, of course, the big man, who typically bases his power, and it is normally a man, on their physical prowess as a warrior, tends to lose that as they age. And in those societies, it's quite rare for representation of status due to age. This, again, indicates a tribal society, more complex possibly than the phase A tribal society, maybe with more economic sophistication, maybe more surpluses, but one which has not yet made the transition to a ranked society. But phase C is much more complex. And what's really interesting is that the types of vessel were not used to as input variables in the clustering, and yet, as you can see from the vessel column here, each of the clusters, many of them have statistically significant correlations with vessel type. So the cluster, which is the highest status evaluation, if you like, statistically significant correlation with cordoned urns. The second one, a statistically significant correlation with encrusted urns, and the third one with cordoned urns. So again, it's considering that's independent of the clustering process, it suggests that these pottery groupings have social significance. It's also really interesting that although there are child burials in the middle ranking status clusters, there are no child burials in the two highest status clusters, and the highest status clusters have a statistically significant overrepresentation of adult males and an overrepresentation also of placement in mounds and cairns. And this looks very like the sort of the social structure that we would expect from peoples and Cos correlates of an advanced chiefdom, if you like, a chiefdom with ranking probably based around control of prestige goods. Also, it's quite interesting when we look at the numbers of people. Whenever we look at the numbers of people in each of the bands of status value, enumerated in the 1-0 sort of energy level system, briefly laid out earlier on, you see this ranking pyramid, which is again one of the correlates that Peoples and Cos suggest that you should see in an advanced chiefdoms type society. You can see that the status value of 4, if you like, has only got about a quarter of the number of people of the status value of 3 to 4, which itself is significantly less than the status value of 2 to 2.9. The only fly in the ointment of that ranking pyramid, if you like, is that the lowest class does not seem to be as numerous as the second group within that. And also, there's one particular cluster which doesn't seem to fit. It is very common in cairns. It possibly is an overrepresentation of children and males, but it's a potless cluster. And it's a potless cluster in which very few have radiocarbon dates. And it's possible that some of these are actually later Bronze Age burials, which have simply got integrated into my database because of their proximity to early Bronze Age burials and the lack of radiocarbon dating to hive them off, if you like. So just before talking a little bit more about a few of the processes which maybe led to the emergence of the single burial tradition, change within the single burial tradition, and then the end of the single burial tradition. I'm just going to very quickly summarize again our three phases of funerary activity, each one of increasing complexity, which itself would imply the emergence of a ranked society or a hierarchical society sometime during this period. And then, of course, the cluster analysis, which very much seems to link the correlates of a ranked chiefdom, as Peebles and Cuss called it, with the detail of the single burial tradition. The origins, I've already mentioned Ross Island, and the fact that Ross Island copper working is generally thought to be the work of immigrants. It's a copper tradition, if you like, which appears fully fledged in Ireland. It's not as if someone went away on holiday, observed a bit of copper working or helped out for a while and brought back a half-assed idea of how to make copper objects. These were people who arrived and from day one were making very sophisticated copper smelting techniques, using very sophisticated copper smelting techniques. There is, of course, as we're now aware, quite a lot of evidence for sort of DNA, step DNA and stuff that got making its way across Europe. And it's very tempting to link up the movement of copper, as has been done by many people over the years, and the spread of beaker vessels across Western Europe. We do, of course, find beaker at Ross Island, although it's not in a burial. Billy O'Brien thinks it might be in a domestic context. That may well be. I know there's some dispute about whether that looks a bit like a settlement beside Ross Island is actually a settlement or some ritual activity. But we don't get the classic sort of Northern European beaker burial really in Ireland. We do, of course, get wedge tombs, and there are beakers placed within wedge tombs, and probably in direct association with burials, but they're not in individual burials. But when you think about it, I mean, I know they're a different tradition, but nevertheless, the Irish single burial tradition, especially the kists with an associated bowl or vase, it does look very like the beaker tradition. They're not beakers, but they really are very similar. The motifs on them are very similar. The crouched positions very similar. In fact, when you look in detail at some of the orientations of, it's beyond the scope of this talk tonight, but the orientations of some of the Irish inhumation burials, even the sides that men and women are being left on, left side or right side, orientations of the head, there are broad similarities with aspects of the beaker tradition in Britain. And I suppose this is really something that can't really be, there's probably not enough yet real evidence to completely nail this down, but in the centuries after the emergence of Ross Island, Irish copper is being brought into Britain. It's certainly being brought into Scotland. It's being brought up the Great Glen. When you start getting up into northeast Scotland, there all of the copper artifacts are in northeast Scotland are using Irish copper. The stone circles in northeast Scotland look so much like the Munster ones. I know that some people say the Munster ones are a little bit later, but the similarity is shocking sometimes in the morphology of them, because they're not just simple stone circles. They're stone circles with flanking stones and recumbent stones and two flanking stones opposite the entranceway. They're so similar to their Irish analogues as to be hard to explain by coincidence alone. And they're at opposite ends of this, I suppose you could call it trading route through Ireland and up into Scotland. And Scotland, of course, Eastern Scotland, particularly in Central Scotland, has the classic beaker burial tradition. And this sort of beaker burial here, they're beaker and artifacts rather, are from Chalcolithic, which is near Inverness, and it's classic beaker burial in every respect. It's about 2250 BC, I think, off the top of my head. I should have noted it down on the slide. But what was really interesting was when the isotopes of the deceased were analysed. The person was Irish, probably from northeast Ireland, County Antrim in all probability, and it's tempting to think, gosh, is that an Irish copper trader, someone who made their way, bringing copper into Scotland, going up through the Great Glen, and then either died or married or it became integrated into the society around Inverness and died there and was buried in the local manor. Have we got a sort of an intercourse in all senses of the word going on along the North Channel and into Scotland, where groups are meeting and interacting and trading and adopting new artifact styles, and maybe groups moving, small groups, lots of thousands of micro interactions along sort of the North Channel, leading to a sort of a hybrid sort of burial tradition in parts of Western Scotland, because of course you get the Irish single burial tradition, you get the Irish kissed burial types with vases and bowls in Western Scotland as well. And is there a kind of an emergent cultural phenomenon which then moves down through the rest of Ireland, if you like, bringing in and eventually making its way back to Munster, where all of this copper originally came from? That's a bit of a kite without a little bit more evidence, yet more isotope evidence, yet more radiocarbon evidence. But I think it is probably something like that. Certainly, at about the time of Stuart Needham, at about the time that the Irish, or just before the Irish food vessels, if you like, the bowls and the vases are appearing, is talking in terms of the beaker traditions of Northern Britain of a fission horizon, where they all split up, and the old certainties of a very well defined beaker burial culture start to fray, and it's almost exactly that time when the Irish food vessel culture of bowls and vases and burials emerges. So that I think it's quite likely the two are linked, considering their proximity both geographically and their proximity chronologically. So then, societies very often can maintain continuity for quite a long time without anything really happening, even though the conditions for change are maybe building for decades. It takes a crisis before something happens. And we're sitting here using Zoom. The technology for Zoom has been around for quite a while. It's been around for 10, 15 years, something like that. I know it was a bit of a slideshow, but this is a slideshow. Nobody can see me. They can hear me. We could have done this probably 20 years ago, but we didn't until there was a crisis. Meetings at work, if you'd have said we're going to do an internet meeting, people thought, what, are you too lazy to come into work? That's what they would have thought. And then we had a crisis and everything changed. And sometimes the conditions for change can be around for decades or maybe even centuries before the change occurs. And when you look at Ireland in phase A and phase B, actually, you've got all the conditions, really, that you would imagine you would need for the emergence of a hierarchical society. You've got land, you've got resources, you've got surplus, you've got gold, you've got lovely artifacts, you've got skilled craftspeople, and yet it doesn't happen immediately. We can probably see a period of maybe a couple of 100 years. And everything just seems to continue as it was, with very little. There's more evidence for complexity in phase B, but there's really, when we look at it in detail, there's no evidence for more ranking. And yet suddenly, or relatively suddenly, in phase C, there does seem to be. And what's quite interesting is when we look at the sort of what's happening in Ireland, you actually see similar things are kind of happening in other parts of Britain and Western Europe. You've got the Wessex, you've got the lots going on in Brittany, and of course the Breton influence on Wessex, and Breton influence is also into Ireland. And what is the big thing that's maybe happening that causes? Sorry, what are the big things that cause that Ireland to change, if you like, in this period? And I've come to the conclusion that really what's likely to happen is the demise of the Ross Island copper mine around 1900 or 1950 BC. The demise of the Ross Island copper mine is is after 2000 AD, and it seems to be very closely linked to the time period when we see the change to a ranked society in phase C. And how could a resource crisis actually provoke hierarchy rather than damaging hierarchy? You might expect that a resource crisis would have the opposite effect, but actually, if copper has been plentiful and has been traded by small, if you like, traders and miners and craft workers around Britain and Ireland for several hundred years, it might have been actually quite a democratizing thing. Nobody would have had control of it. But if all of a sudden it starts to become scarce, then it starts to have value. And of course, the power moves away from the miner and the distributor, and it moves really maybe towards the craftsman and the person who can recycle it. And more likely, actually, the aggressive person who's likely to set themselves up as someone who can control the craftspeople and control the recycling. And all of a sudden, copper and bronze will have had a value that they hadn't got previously, because all of a sudden it was scarce. And I think that this copper crisis, and there almost certainly was a copper crisis, because we can even see in Britain, it's at least 100 or 200 years before any of the Welsh mines come into play. It's 1400 BC, something like that, maybe 1300 BC, before some of the other mines in Ireland and Ulster start to come into production. And there is certainly in southern Britain copper being brought from continental Europe, but there's no doubt that lines of communication, lines of trade were very stretched, and copper must have become a much more desirable, or not more desirable, but much more sought after commodity once its supply tap was turned off sometime between 2000 and 1900 BC. And then the other change, that's what we're sort of just saying, that I think the same sort of thing. I think this has affected not just Ireland, but it's affected Wessex and probably Yorkshire and Scotland, and all the sort of the early Bronze Age sort of emergence of what looks like ranked societies at about the same time, and probably stimulated by this copper crisis, and the idea, if you like, of ranking being spread by that old archaeological favourite, peer polity interaction, wherever you have sort of groups of people in close proximity to each other, how by emulation they'll develop similar structures and similar societies over a relatively short period of time. And then to go to the other end of the early Bronze Age, as we're getting to the end of the early Bronze Age, and depending on what way you sort of phrase it, the late middle or the late Bronze Age, or whatever term you want to use, but sometime after 1600 BC, the single burial tradition, as we knew it previously, seems to come to an end. And by the late Bronze Age, and by the way, I don't claim any special expertise in the late Bronze Age, and there are people who are much better able to talk about late Bronze Age and burial in detail than I. But the basic idea of the late Bronze Age, which is a very pared down funerary tradition with cremation burials placed into very simple pits, sometimes just even barely token burials, just a part of the human remains buried in the ground. A much pared down funerary tradition compared to the Irish early Bronze Age single burial tradition. The idea that this might have its ancestry in the potless-burial tradition of that I mentioned earlier, that probably starts in phase B and continues through phase C, is something that I think is deserving of consideration. This is a period when it's likely that there's even further ranking than there was in phase C. We see settlements becoming more common. There's certainly an expansion of agriculture. Rowan's work, again, needs a certain amount of normalization and calibration, but he's on to something, I think, with increasing population in that period of time. There's even more increasing sophistication with metalwork. Swords become very common, real weapons, not just daggers and the occasional halberd. But the burials it's become simpler, hard to detect archaeologically. I say rarely found by accident. I mean, they're not found in excavations. Research excavations are frequently found, of course, on rescue excavations that open large areas of ground. And I think that what's probably happening here is something along the lines of what Mike Parker Pearson called ideological masking. And Mike Parker Pearson was doing some work in the 80s. I'm sure many of you have read it on 19th century burials in Oxford, and he noticed that the classic Victorian industrialist burial was a lovely big burial monument, a huge big thing like Cleopatra's Needle or something like that, with all sorts of carvings and extravagance, tens of thousands of pounds of in our money today, tens of thousands of pounds of work, and he drew a direct, as Binford or others would, a direct line between the social complexity, the funerary complexity, and the personal status of the individual being buried. But then when he was examining the 20th century burials, he noticed that there was a change, that as the 20th century progressed, that everybody's burials seemed to become, simpler, and that instead of these great sort of monoliths or great sort of monuments to these wonderful men, and they mostly were men of wealth, that that the burials were all of a sudden just little black marble sort of gravestones like we all have nowadays, and it didn't seem to matter how wealthy the person was. And our burials are still like that. You go into a graveyard now, and there are very few elaborate burials. Most burials are very similar. I'm sure when Elon Musk gets to Mars, and a week later when they all kill him and bury him, I'm sure despite his huge wealth, he'll just have a little black marker, somewhere in the orange sands or down, with his name on it. And Mike Parker Pearson said that really in very ranked societies, sometimes society wants to hide wealth, or rather to hide, not so much hide wealth, but wants to hide to the fact that there are real differences between people based on their social status, and that this sort of idea that we're all in this together, to use the famous David Cameron quote back in 2010 or 11, when the economy went on the skids for the first time, first time recently, that idea that we're all in it together can be demonstrated by the idea, well, you can't take it with you, and we're all the same in death, and all these sort of platitudes that are made around status and death, and that this ideological masking is a common feature in that occurs at certain points in certain ranked societies or stratified societies. And I think that it's quite possible that what we're seeing in the late Bronze Age is the adoption of the parsimonious potless-burial tradition, or its continuation as the sole representative of burial from the early Bronze Age into the late Bronze Age, because this was a period when there was ideological marking of status. And I think we can see that, we see it in many ways. I think we can see it in feasting culture. The idea of the big tent, where again status is being masked by the fact that everyone's in the big tent. They're all taking a portion from the same cauldron. It's shown by the deposition of prestige goods and bogs, which is prestige goods which previously presumably would have been placed in the grave, which are now being placed in bogs and watery places. And this shows, of course, not only that the person making the deposition can afford to make it, but also it keeps the price of copper up by deliberately destroying, and bronze up by deliberately destroying material. And then the other thing, of course, is the fact that we have a profusion of weapons in the late Bronze Age, which shows a new level of stratification and elite attempts to control society. What I don't know, and what I haven't found a link yet, I can't see any obvious copper crisis equivalent for around 16 or 1500 BC. Because, as I mentioned, without some sort of a crisis, very often things tend to stay the same for centuries. But something clearly happened around 16 or 1500 BC to change funerary ritual. And while it does involve some sort of ideological masking, either society got to such a level of stratification that there was resistance to that, and therefore a combination of coercion and ideology became important to allow the emergent elite to maintain control, or else there was some sort of other environmental or economic shock which caused people to respond in different ways. As yet, I don't think we know the answer. So to draw to a very late conclusion, marred by all sorts of technical difficulties, and I'll certainly happily answer questions in a few minutes. I think I'll probably have to switch somehow computer technology to manage to be able to hear again, but because I haven't been able to hear you, although I think you can hear me. But just to run through a few conclusions before I readjust my sound again. Metal workers appearing in Ireland around 2500 BC-ish. And then, of course, there's metal trade around the North Sea Channel. And it's likely that the interaction of metal traders in Scotland develops either in Scotland or in Ireland or in the Larne Strand or Ferry, a new community perhaps and a new burial tradition that then is reintroduced either moves into different bits of Ireland and is introduced into Scotland, or alternatively is introduced from Scotland into Ireland and makes its way down. We don't have enough resolution to know that yet. And this early initial metalworking society is a tribal society, but it's a tribal society with surpluses and specialization and skills. But at least initially it's not ranked. There is some indication for increasing complexity as time goes on, but this increasing complexity is still probably not ranking in the true sense of the word, but probably involves something like available offices being filled by people with the appropriate sort of characteristics. So a bit like some of the Native American tribes who would have had positions of chief, where you could achieve chiefdom by certain notches on your belt, certain achievements in life, but the number of chiefs was not necessarily limited. It was not restricted. You could, if you were good enough, you would get there as long as you tried. That sort of idea maybe represents phase B. And then phase C, we're moving into a proper chiefdom as such, where there's likely to be an aristocracy, maybe even a royalty, that is controlling the metal trade. And it's likely that a shortage of metal trade occasioned by the collapse of production at Ross Island is a significant factor in the emergence of these sort of really stratified societies, not just in Ireland, but quite likely in Britain as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I'm going to go back to Zoom on my phone, and hopefully
Can you hear us, Cormac?
in a second or two, you'll be able to hear me again, I hope. Or I'll be able to hear you.
Cormac, can you hear us?
Nearly there. If someone admits me.
I think I'm speaking. I'm not. No, thank you.
Cormac, can you hear us?
Recording in progress.
Okay, while we're waiting for Cormac to be
Hello?
ready. Can you hear us, Cormac?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Very good. Okay. Look,
Sorry about that.
thank you very much. That was a really fascinating lecture, and you're at right angles to this. Okay, that was a really fascinating lecture with a lot of information in it. Really important work teasing out the chronology of these burials and the pottery types and the various influences. So thank you very much for that.
Not at all. It's my pleasure. I just wish it had been a slightly smoother journey for you all.
No, it's really important work that you've been carrying out. I know you could only summarize it in your lecture, so I will product placement again. say to UAS members, if you want to read more about what Cormac's been talking about tonight, I do recommend that you pick up the book that he published last year. So would you be available to take some questions now, Cormac?
Absolutely, yes. I'll try and field any ones I can. Field's maybe not the big word. Answer any ones I can.
Right. Has anyone any questions at the minute for Cormac? Okay, so we have a question here saying, Cormac, since the urns and food vessels were placed in the kiss graves upside down, how were they sealed? There don't appear to be lids.
Well, the urns were certainly placed upside down. Generally speaking, the food vessels are placed the right way up, if you like. There are the occasional exception to that. There are a few vases which have the ceramics stuffed into them. There does seem to be crystalline. I think Doug one, which he detected evidence of a sod probably had been placed on top of the urn to turn it up. Other people have speculated on membranes being placed over the skin or hide or something like that being placed, and the function of maybe the collars and things like that on collared urns, concordance and cordon urns, having facilitated drawstrings being placed around them to sort of to help provide a seal. But I mean, as you can imagine, solid evidence, experimental evidence is useful, but solid excavation evidence in something of that age of what's likely to be an organic compound is only going to be encountered in the most occasional, unlikely circumstance. So there's very little to say for certain, but those seem to be the two main likelihoods: sods and organic membranes, essentially fastened with cord or string or rawhide or similar.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. There's another observation, I think, from Ewell Urban, saying, I think that man was finding the easiest way to bury a person. Cremation would have been easier than digging a 5-foot grave. Only a smaller area is needed, and kiss stones would be easier if smaller. So is it basically the amount, you're talking about the amount of effort needed? The smaller the grave, the less effort needed?
Well, there's an element of truth in that. I dug myself in dry sun. I had a terrible experience earlier this year. My 12-year-old retriever, who has been my near constant companion every time I'm in the house, died, and I had to bury her. And I buried her in sandy soil at the top of a field. And I dug a grave myself, and she was a big dog, and it was the similar size to a pit or a kist. And it took me about 2 hours, now with a good metal shovel, obviously, and spade, a good bulldog spade. It took me about 2 hours to dig the grave. Now, if I had have been cremating a human, I think the estimate is you need to do a proper cremation. You need about 600 kilograms of wood to do a proper cremation. Now, there's not just the effort of cutting down that wood and chopping it into the proper sizes. You may even want, of course, to let that wood season for a little while if you want, a really intense fire. But also, there's the issue that there are resources there which you don't then have to heat and to cook. And of course, we're talking about a society in which the bulk of the landscape is probably open, and what wooded resources there are may be quite carefully curated. So I know what you're saying. In certain soil types, yes, digging a 1 meter box, 1 meter deep is, 1 meter square by 1 meter deep, say, is a lot of effort to go to. The actual digging is not the only factor to be taken into account, because when you dig a 1 meter square patch, you don't necessarily lose a huge amount of agricultural potential, but when you cut down 600 kilograms of trees and burn it, you're losing a lot of something else that you can use in your day-to-day basis. I know it's something that Brian and I have talked quite a lot about too, about the Bronze Age and trees and cremation and what the effect it must have had.
Yeah. Okay. Another question from Charles Little. Around 2500 BC, it seems to be the year zero for the nature of society in Ireland. Is there any read across from societies that existed in the late Neolithic?
Well, you see, that's the big $64,000 question. I mean, certainly the DNA work that's been done by the Smurfit Institute and Laura Cassidy and Dan Bradley and Eileen and others, looking at sort of Rathlin DNA and other Irish DNA and comparing it with Neolithic DNA, suggests a little bit, but not that much continuity. And I might be paraphrasing this or summarizing this incorrectly, and if I am, somebody jump in and tell me, but not that much continuity between late Neolithic DNA and the DNA that we see in the early Bronze Age and subsequently through history. So there may not be a huge population continuity. Having said that, that may just be because the late Neolithic society has declined in terms of population again. Rowan's sort of point that change may happen in Ireland at times when the population is on the wane. It may even encourage it. There doesn't seem. I mean, we don't have a huge number of early Bronze Age, or for that matter, late Neolithic settlement archaeology to compare and contrast. We have slightly different artifact types. We've got the sort of grooved ware complex, and then we've got the sort of beaker and then food vessel complex. I mean, I would be very loath to say that there isn't continuity across them, but it's really hard to put your finger on. And I think that's something that's being found not just in Ireland, but it's been found in British archaeology as well. It's difficult, and other people would have other ideas, but I think it's hard to find a smoking gun that suggests there has to be a lot of continuity from the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age or Chalcolithic early Bronze Age.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Anne McDermott, and it's going back to the earlier question about urns, and Anne's asking, what might be the reason for the inversion of urns in kind of funerary?
Well, there have been a few people have speculated this. Chris again and others have speculated the idea of the upturned house. That somehow the motifs on urns represent some sort of wicker work or something like that, or thatch. And although there are lots of those motifs are shared with other artifact types as well. The other reason, of course, is that I suppose that the center of gravity is lower if you turn it, so it's not likely to topple over, especially if you were initially putting it into something. Because that concept of the grave lying behind, the body, there are at least a few examples of upturned urns placed into quite large rectangular kists, and if you didn't upturn them, the likelihood is they would fall over. So it could be as simple as that. But I haven't got a definitive answer on that. But certainly there are one or two vases which have been filled with cremated bone and have been set the right way up, excuse me, in kist graves, and they have fallen over. So, maybe that experience alone said, really, maybe we should put them in this way.
Could it be as protection from animals, burrowing animals, or keeping them safe? Just doing the right thing by them. I mean, you're right. I mean, people today go to great lengths to keep from everything from lead-lined coffins to everybody wants to believe that their loved ones' remains have been well protected from the elements and burrowing animals, everything, as you say. Well, we have a question from Jim Conway. Brilliant, Cormac. Would you think that the mythology of Tua, orphaned daughter of Conall Colmarac, was from phase 3?
Oh, no, you're talking. I would say it's very likely, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Another question from Leo Van Ness. Can an element of multiculturalism account for the perplexing varieties in the funerary practice?
Absolutely. In fact, I have tentatively suggested in the book that you, especially in phase C, you may be looking at two. There's a concept that anthropologists have in the moiety. I'm sure maybe many have come across it. Where within a sort of geographical region, you may have almost, in fact, Northern Ireland's a moiety for all intents and purposes. You have two mirror images, both dependent on each other for their own sense of identity, but to some extent living parallel but similar lives, And a bit of me thinks that, and again, maybe this is just conditioning from where we live, that the encrusted urns and vase urns on the one side and the coloured and cordoned urns on the other side may reflect that kind of moiety-based structure, where you have a society which is a unitary whole, but in which there are two parallel strands running within it, performing slightly different roles and reflecting each other and identifying in opposition to each other, almost, if you like. So yes, I think very much so. I think that's correct.
When you say identifying or in opposition to, are you thinking in terms of different origins?
Well, big question. Some people have noted that cordoned urns, there's cordoned urns phase A and phase B. I can't remember, phase 1 and phase 2 or whatever the typology is. That the earlier, coloured urns, not coloured. Coloured urns, phase A coloured urns or phase 1 coloured urns, whatever the typology, I can't remember, are slightly earlier in Britain, and they don't really occur very much in Ireland. There are only 1 or 2 examples in Ireland. Most of the coloured urns in Ireland are the later type. Having said that, urns generally from radiocarbon dating seem to be earlier in Ireland than in Britain. So vase urns and encrusted urns in Ireland seem to be earlier than any urn variety in Britain so far dated. Now, that might just be because, we've, thanks to the work of Anna Brindley, for instance, we've done a lot of work in this country now on dating urns. There's been comparatively less done in other regions. So it may well change, but at present it seems like the Irish examples might be a little bit earlier. So I think that rather than have an origin point, I think we have a milieu of a cultural milieu. We have at least elements of these cultures are quite mobile. They're dependent on resources very much from Ireland and from Cornwall, and they get about simply, and they intermix, and they share ideas and share concepts. And I think that at different time there may be elements of ethnogenesis for a while, but then the Rubik cube sort of spins up again, and it all sort of reworks itself. Interestingly, and I must chase this up, and I've only ever read about a couple of passing references, and I must try and chase them up sometime. There are supposed to be encrusted urns in Brittany, so it could be that these people are, at least some of them, are very mobile.
Very good, excellent. Okay, thank you very much. So Leo Layden said, brilliant lecture, Cormac, learned so much, put so much into perspective, great work on the chronology, well done your research. Charles Little said, wonderful lecture, very thought-provoking, many thanks, Cormac. Brian Scott has, and referencing back to the upturned urns, he said, hey, Brian, all of the Closkelt County Down urns were inverted onto a slab of stone.
That's right, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Fanula saying, great research and ideas, thanks. There are thousands of Hindu cremations every year. Has the method and amount of wood in them been studied to throw light on the cremations?
It's actually the 600 kilogram figure comes from an analysis of Hindu cremation. That's where it comes from. Yeah, and that was supposed to be a painting of a Hindu cremation that I had on the cremation page, but it's not a very good one. But that's where the value comes from. And I mean, it's possible that by careful choice of wood and drying of wood, you might make some difference to that, but it's going to be a scale of, it's not going to be a scale of magnitude difference.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Zachary O'Gladden has asked. It says that it appears that burial objects are practical, beads, knives, etc. Any evidence during the Bronze Age of blatantly religious objects at burial locations?
Well, no. I would argue that there may well be some religious significance in some of the iconography on some of the funerary vessels. Sun motif turns up quite a lot. You look at certain bowls in particular, and I mean, I think it's what do you call her? Oh, so bad with names tonight. Mary Cahill suggests that that some bowls are deliberately designed when you raise them almost to drink out of them to have a sort of sun rosette on the bottom of them. A lot of them do that actually, and considering that sun symbolism is quite common in the early and middle and the Bronze Age and later iconography, I think there's a possibility there's a religious element in that. Beyond that, I think that I suppose it depends where you draw the line between ritual and belief and religion. But certainly the concepts of potentially things like cremation to release the remains or the spirit to the afterlife more quickly is, I suppose, in the widest sense the word, a religious concept. Other objects don't appear to be specifically religious. Everything else could be explained as a personal object or an object representing the dead. There are occasionally a few sort of odd little stones and things like that, which are clearly chosen to be placed into the grave, crystals and things like that. But it's hard to again put your finger in anything specific.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. David Craig has asked, what do you think a plain man's burial might look like, as elaborate burial seems to be the ones that survive?
Well, you never really know, I suppose, what percentage. It's always the $64,000. That's twice I've used that. And it's very on inflation corrected that figure. But it's always the big question is what bit of the archaeology you're not seeing, what bit is neither been found or is rotted or simply hasn't been afforded funerary rituals. So there's always the possibility that the poorest of the poor receive no funerary treatment whatsoever. Having said that, when you look at the say phase C, the cluster analysis and the 8 or 9 different groups and the Urns, more than that actually, and the patterning into 3 broad bands of status, I think the likelihood is that simple burial with say in phase C, simple burial, simple cremation in a pit or a small kist, maybe accompanied by a flint scraper or maybe a flint knife or something like that, is a very normal and typical sort of burial ritual. I think in the periods before phase C, the distance between an ordinary I think before phase C there really only were ordinary people. And I think everyone was an ordinary person in phase A. And I think in phase B, everyone's still an ordinary person, but if you've achieved something special in your life, they'll remember it. But it's not elevating. It's elevating you, but it's not elevating your lineage, if you know what I mean, in phase B. So I think for those two earlier phases, I mean, an inhumation in a kist burial is likely to be with an accompanying sort of bowl or vase is likely to be typical of the burial of an ordinary person. Maybe later on, cremation being added to that. And I think when we start to see choices. I mean, people who are fond of status are often in the choices. We're going to lower taxes to give people greater choices. Choices is associated with status, and whenever people have status, they want more choices to reflect that status in everything, and that includes burial ritual. So in the period when we start to see burial ritual choices, that's when we're seeing status. But before that, everyone's probably ordinary. Unless we're missing something. All the people they threw in the ditch or something like that by the dogs.
Okay, thank you. Brian Scott's got back to us again saying there's a paper that suggests that cremations can be as low as 80 kilograms, but the average is around 400.
All right, I'd like to see that, yeah.
And then Vanilla said thanks, and Liz Curtis said so. Liz Curtis has said so much food for thought. Many thanks. Veronica Williams, great talk, Cormac, thank you. Trevor Boyd, super talk, Cormac, thank you. I have a question as well. I know you didn't have time to go into it, but have you any thoughts on the whole idea of curated remains? Now, the one Bronze Age kist that I directed and published in Ulster Journal 64 down in Newton Stewart Castle, there was a segmented kist with 2 cremated burials and 2 pots. And it would appear that there were the cremated remains were of a juvenile, 12 to 15 years, and a lady in her 40s and 50s. And it would appear that the juveniles were several hundred years older than the lady, but they were buried at the same time. And I remember we talked about it, and I put it into the paper. We raised the whole idea of the curation of cremated remains and the reburial at a later stage. Do you know, has your work shown how common or not common this practice was, or what's your thoughts on it?
Well, the first thing I would say is I think that, and I know we've talked about this at length. I think that the Newton Stewart examples that you talk about are probably likely to reflect one of two things. One, which is a diet possibly high in freshwater fish, which, as we know, can cause essentially old carbon to make its way into the food chain in a manner which is not predictable in the way that, say, sea-based carbon can be. That's the first possibility. Or else contaminants. I think it's very unusual in that case. The idea that, especially the gap between them, which is 300 or 400 years, is very big. And everything else about them is identical. The method of cremation seems identical. The ages between them almost suggest, a sort of mother-daughter relationship. The two funerary vessels are identical. But there are a few examples, and I can't remember the site name. There are a number of examples where it looks very likely that remains have been brought somewhere else and reburied. So there's one particular set of two burials where the remains are disarticulated, but they're disarticulated in inhumation. They haven't obviously rotted in the grave. They've been brought as a bundle of bones from elsewhere. And the two funerary vessels which are placed with them are both fragmented. And although most of the sherds are there are a few missing from each one. So the implication being that somebody has shifted this grave from one location to another. So exhumed essentially and moved on. So there are those sort of practices are definitely present in the archaeological record for the early Bronze Age period. The other thing about there are odd little things turn up all the time. So for instance, sometimes you will find a multiple burial with 2 or 3 human remains, and maybe one of the sets of human remains is just represented by 1 or 2 bones. Is that representative of disturbance of an earlier burial, or is it representative of some sort of religious magical practice, or is it simply like the when a king is their heart is buried in one place and their body's buried somewhere else? Is it simply distributing the bones around different family members for some particular reason? I have a friend who died recently, and half a dozen of us have little bits of his cremated remains. So these things happen now and happen organically almost sometimes. And so very circuitous. Nothing certain for the sort of curation that I think you're talking about, something being kept for a very long period of time and then reinterred somewhere. But that doesn't mean it isn't happening. There are enough odd little bits in the archaeological record that, if you went in a targeted attempt to find that curative sort of behaviour, I think there's a fair chance you could find it in the early Bronze Age burial record. But I can't put hand on heart and say it's there.
But even if it was there, it would be a small percentage.
I think it would be a small percentage. I don't think it's a very common. But then again, I mean, there's the work, again, some of Mike Parker Pearson and others' work, on these later Bronze Age, admittedly, but sort of portmanteau people, and all that sort of thing, So there are so many practices whenever you start to cast your net widely enough. Okay,
thank you very much. Trevor Boyd, super talk. Cormac, thank you. Catherine, many thanks. Cormac, great talk. Annie, Cormac, so much to think about. Many thanks. Has anyone any last questions for Cormac? Anybody? No? Okay, Cormac. Well, look, thank you very much for a really engaging, really interesting, full of fascinating kind of facts and a lot of stuff to think about, and to say all contained in your book for people who want to kind of.
You know, sleep well at night.
And also, I mean, you're allowing us to put this up on YouTube.
Oh, absolutely, yeah,
So
yeah.
people, there's a lot in here, so that people can get a chance to really watch again at their leisure, if you're happy with that.
Absolutely, yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So lots of thanks from various people, Anne Harper and Rebecca Presler, and from Declan Hurl, and from Professor Eileen Murphy, and from Courtney Mund. So thank you, Cormac. Thank you to Duncan. As always, Duncan facilitates all our online lectures and the conference. So the person behind the technology. So thank you, Dr. Duncan Berryman. Next Monday, Monday the 28th, is the UAS's annual general meeting, and that's taking place, I think, at 7:30. So for UAS members, our AGM is next Monday. Our next monthly lecture is on Monday the 28th of March, and it's Dr. Finbar McCormick talking about sacred waters, cures, penance, and holy fish. So Finbar McCormick, 28th of March is our next talk. Cormac, anything last thoughts?
No, thank you for being a very considerate audience with great questions, which I very much enjoyed, and some great comments, things to follow up. Sorry about the sound.
Can I just ask a question?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Just you mentioned earlier in your lecture, which was very good, I must say I enjoyed it. You mentioned about Ross Island copper mines, obviously very important for that age that you're talking about. Is that location identified, and has it historic preservation for tourists, etc.?
Well, I'm not sure if it's tourist access. Oh, yes, it's definitely been identified. It was actually discovered by Professor Billy O'Brien down in Cork in the 1990s, and he carried out some excavations there, which were able to identify the date of the mine, identify the type of mine working that was carried out, the type of copper working that was carried out. He found areas where the copper had been worked, and the copper cakes for to be transported, if you like, ingots almost. And he found what he interpreted as a little settlement beside it. And I think he's now changing his mind and thinks there's an element of ritual activity going on there too. So it's very much it's a little inland loch, quite close to the sort of Cork Kerry border, and I don't think it's it's not open to the public as a tourist attraction, if you like, but I think it's anybody can go and visit it. But it would be best to check out the ground first, because I know it's it's obviously there are all sorts of health and safety considerations. So if you were there on your own and people didn't know where you were going, I would leave to go with someone and leave notice of when you were going and when you were going to be going back, because it could be quite treacherous.
Well, Billy O'Brien has published a lot about it, so you can check out his
absolutely big monograph. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Not at all.
Okay. Any last questions? Been a really enjoyable evening. So once more, thank you, Cormac, for a great talk, and we'll see a lot of you next week at our AGM. Thanks. Oh, John, one final comment from John Martin. The wood burnt to smelt the copper at Ross Island must have made cremation rather expensive.
Well, actually, I mean that's the big thing, is how much is cremation of a potentially quite large population. If everybody's getting it done, how much is that impacting on wood resources?
Absolutely. Okay, well, we'll leave that as our hanging thought for tonight. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to Duncan. Most of all, thank you to Cormac. So, and we'll see most of you next week at our AGM. So thanks. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.